We're back to my dulcet tones for a little while. Let's explore attachment styles. What if attachment styles are getting it wrong? What if it's more about collapse styles over attachment? In traditional psychology, attachment styles are typically broken into four broad types: secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized. These categories have been helpful in describing surface level patterns of human closeness, fear, and intimacy. However, mirrored psychic inversion theory, MPIT, posits that these so called styles are not static personality traits or learned behaviors. Rather, they are reactive psychic structures born out of trauma, collapse, and reflex. MPIT reframes attachment as a dynamic stress response system governed by the internal interplay of anticipatory terror, affective inversion, and symbolic annihilation. At the core of this process lies the anticipatory stress reflex complex, a tri-phase nervous system model that explains how our sense of self is constructed and how it collapses under threat. ASR1 is the infantile annihilatory terror that forms when the caregiver fails to regulate the infant's nervous system. ASR2 is the adult's attempt to anticipate threat, predict abandonment, and preemptively manage relational safety. ASR3 is the symbolic rupture that occurs when reality disconfirms the self's internalized assumptions, leading to collapse. When we examine secure attachment, we find a system in which ASR1 terror was properly held in early life. The infant's catastrophic emotions were mirrored and regulated by a good enough caregiver. ASR2 was therefore not overwhelmed. The adult can function with appropriate anticipation, bounded autonomy, and real intimacy. There is no need for collapse, no false self, and no symbolic fragmentation. The good enough object remained good enough. By contrast, in anxious, preoccupied attachment, the caregiver was inconsistent or partially absent. This created a situation where ASR1 was only partially sealed. The terror was not catastrophic but lingered. ASR2 becomes overactive, hypervigilant, and always scanning for rupture. In the adult, this manifests as clinginess, idealization, and a desperate need to preempt abandonment. The collapse occurs when the object inevitably withdraws or fails to live up to the fantasy. The internal logic of this pattern is, if I can be enough, they won't leave. But the idealized mother never returns. The libidinal loop is never closed. Avoidant dismissive attachment reflects a different ASR profile. In this case, ASR1 terror is completely frozen, locked beneath a wall of emotional detachment. The child was not murdered or was engulfed and learned to rely on themselves. ASR2 becomes muted or entirely avoided. Intimacy is dangerous because it threatens to crack open the sealed ASR1 vault. When closeness arises, collapse ensues, often sudden and inexplicable. This adult chooses freedom over connection and control over vulnerability. Disorganized or fearful avoidant attachment arises when the caregiver was both the source of love and terror, often through abuse or unpredictable behavior. In this case, ASR1 is unsealed and fragmented. The annihilatory panic of the infant remains live. ASR2 is chaotic, with no coherent strategy. The individual wants intimacy but is terrified of it. They become flooded with contradictory signals. Collapse in this case often takes the form of psychic splitting or even psychic regression. The inner logic is, love will annihilate me, but without love I don't exist. There is no safe home inside the self. The good and bad object have fused. MPIT also identifies hybrid and distorted forms of attachment that do not cleanly fit within the traditional categories. These collapse styles reflect shifting ASR dominance and introjective fragmentation. One such example is the ambivalent collapse style, where the child was idealized and ignored in rotating cycles. This creates conflicting internal introjects. ASR1 terror bleeds through ASR2, which becomes a brittle pseudo adult shell. The adult oscillates between appeasement and cold withdrawal. The internal roles of false protector and mute child are intro-changed, depending on which part of the self is dominant. Another hybrid form is the trauma-bonded submission style, where the child learned that love and pain arrive together. ASR2 over-adapts, attempting to please and avoid rupture. ASR1 is not resolved but held in check through compulsive fawning. The adult becomes trapped in a masochistic bond with a symbolic redeemer or punisher, unable to leave and unable to thrive. This is often confused with codependency, but is in fact a self preservation loop. The fawning and freeze combination is also common. The child faces unpredictable threat and learns to both flatter and disappear. ASR2 becomes a performance of safety. ASR1 prepares for punishment, even while pleasing the other. The nervous system waits for violence. It is not love, but fear in disguise. The adult becomes addicted to managing others' states while abandoning their own. There are also false secure styles. These individuals may appear regulated and functional, but the reality is that ASR1 has been sealed so tightly that ASR2 builds a false shell of perfection. The adult may succeed in relationships or professional life, but under stress, collapse is sudden and devastating. The inner self was never safe, only hidden. N. Pitt concludes that all attachment styles are symptomatic. They are not fundamental traits, but adaptive mechanisms in response to early relational collapse. The ASR complex is the deeper structure beneath them all. When we shift from asking, "What's your attachment style?" to "What's your collapse style?" we begin to see the nervous system not as a diagnostic box, but as a reactive story of survival. The engines of collapse are buried in the early ability to regulate terror, to seal the self, and mirror reality without love. The pseudo-false self, the orbiting introjects, and the trauma loops all emerge from how the ASR system was built, frozen, and triggered. Where traditional theory ends at behaviour, MPIT begins at the reflex. And it is there in the reflexive architecture of fear and fantasy that the origins of attachment and collapse can finally be understood. Peace out. Loads of love.